Welcome everyone to our XRM virtual meeting on today, October the 23rd of 2018. Today we're going to be talking about Microsoft Dynamics 365 in Azure, a partnership of experience, depth, and exciting growth. So I am your host today, Daryl Labar, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask throughout the presentation in the chat window, and if I need to unmute you, I can do that as well. You can also, later on, if you have questions, you can always email Julie at the email below there, julie.yak@xrmvirtual.com. We are recording, and we will be posting this to our events page, and we'll be posting the video as well out on YouTube, I think, as well as our Dropbox file. So look for that when that gets posted. We are always looking for speakers, so if you are wanting to speak about something, please let us know. If you have a topic that you want to know more about and you need a speaker, please do that as well. We can usually find somebody fairly quickly to speak to whatever that topic is, so your questions should not go unanswered. We have a couple meetings currently lined up, so Marius is going to be talking to us about authentication, how to get it wrong, commonly known as the CRM Viking, if that helps. And Salim will be coming with us next month for Azure Functions and Integration Scenario. So we've got two Azure Functions almost back to back. So awesome. And I will go ahead and turn the presentation over to Ann Stanton. I'll let her introduce herself. So most commonly known as the CRM lady. And hopefully, Ann, you should be seeing your slide deck and have presentation control now.
Let me check. I clicked on Start Presentation, and I'm seeing your deck.
All right, let me switch over to see if that's this.
Perfect.
Okay.
Try again. All right. Welcome, everybody. Really glad to be here. Want to basically set context. I'm going to start at the basics because sometimes when we get deep in the forest and we work with this product for a long time, we forget we don't forget. It's just easy to overlook some of the basics. And then we also have people who are brand new to Dynamics 365, and I want to just start the conversation thinking about Dynamics 365 and Azure. So I'm Ann Stanton, sometimes referred to as the CRM Lady, mostly because I blog under the CRM Lady and tweet under the CRM Lady acronym. I've been debating whether I need to rebrand, but we'll see. I've been focusing on the Dynamics platform since 2004. And just a little bit about my background. I rolled out of school as a developer, did development for a number of years, and then switched to basically growing up into multiple titles and layers of a software development company up to vice president. And then I ran a couple of small businesses and also dove into the inner workings of working at enterprise customers and at Microsoft and at a Microsoft partner. And I also spent 5 years as a consultant at Microsoft. So really interesting background when it comes to the world of Dynamics, and I really love to bring that to the table. So the first thing I want to talk about is search. What's really, really exciting about Microsoft Dynamics 365 and the Azure team is that the Dynamics team and the Azure team are working really closely together, and they have been for a number of years. And this is a little different for those of you who've worked inside Microsoft or know of Microsoft. We really think of Microsoft as one entity, but it's really lots and lots of different little states within this huge corporation, right? 160,000 global employees. And so when the internal teams like Azure and Dynamics work together closely, amazing power happens. So the first thing is search. So what's interesting about search is we, early on in the world of Dynamics 365 Online, we had Relevance Search come out. And Relevance Search is actually taking data from the Dynamics database, pulling it into Azure, giving you Bing-like search, indexing it, and giving you the experience like you don't even know that's happening. You're working in the world of Dynamics. You're working with your data. You're looking up your data. But behind that, with regards to Relevance Search, it's running and using the power of Azure. So we get improved performance because we're not limited to SQL search. We're using much more powerful technology. We can find different types of matches, particularly because the development around this search has been pretty intense. So instead of exact matches or wildcard matches, we have the ability to see like streaming, and streamed in this example. And that's where the word relevance comes in. We also can get kind of highlighted matches, and that power of, hey, we think this is a match, here's the highlight. Similar to your experience in working with, a Google search or a Bing search online. And we have the ability to search on unstructured data like notes and attachments associated with emails. And I think this feature is a little bit underappreciated when you really start looking at it. So one of the first big deliverables between the Azure team and the Dynamics team is this relevant search. So you do have to enable relevant search. So under system settings, right? So you go into the settings menu, you go to administration, you go to system settings, and there's a little checkbox right under general called enable relevant search. Sorry, it's a little blurry. And that will allow you to use relevant search in addition to categorized search. And this is just a little example. I went in, I typed in, my name in my database, relevant search, and it came up with not only my name, my contact record, but contact records which had the word Ann in them, like here, and as well as accounts, notes, and leads, which had any of these Ann or Stanton in them. So if you haven't seen relevant search, this is a really great one to test out. You get to it with this little magnifying glass here up at the top. And if you're used to using categorized search, you see the little drop down here. If you click on that, it gives you relevant search versus categorized search. So
and
you get two options.
Sorry to interrupt. The sharing the PowerPoint does not show your mouse. It just shows the slide. So if you want to do that, you'd have to switch over to sharing your desktop and then showing the mouse, if that is the case.
No, I appreciate that, Daryl. So up the right-hand corner, there's a little magnifying glass. That's how you get to search right on your main toolbar. And then the arrow next to the word relevant search on the left-hand side is where if you drop down that, you would see relevant search versus categorized search. Hopefully that explains what I was doing with my mouse. Any questions with regards to relevant search? Everybody's silent. It's nice to see some familiar names. Scott is actually on the line. Kurt's on the line. Great to see some names from the past. All right, so let's move on. This is one of the basic ones of the Azure team working with the Microsoft team. So let's talk about the Common Data Service. So lots of buzz around CDS, and what is it about CDS and what really is it, right? So Common Data Service, or CDS for apps, kind of stole this some of these definitions from the web, but it basically lets you securely store and manage data that's used by business applications. So what does that mean? It means that Microsoft itself really needs a common place where they can share data between applications within their stack, and they're making this a public offering to their customers of not only Dynamics but other applications. So what we're doing is we're cracking open the ability to move data between Microsoft Dynamics 365 and the SQL databases that manage that, and other applications, mostly from the Microsoft stack, but not just from the Microsoft stack, But think about it from the Microsoft stack. So for instance, I want to move data between my ERP system and my Dynamics 365 system, or share or migrate or integrate without having to do all that work. Office 365. You've known for a number of years integration between Dynamics 365 and Office 365. Lots going on there, right? Everything from the new Office Groups to Microsoft Teams to sharing with OneNote. More and more, you're seeing the integrated platform between Dynamics 365 and the Office 365 applications. Outlook, of course, Power BI, and so many more. So this is all about the common data services. It probably has an S on it. And here I grabbed this picture. I think it really correctly displays kind of this overall really high level picture of the common data service, right? So we've got Dynamics 365, Office 365, mobile apps, web apps, so many more. But the idea is to tie them together with a little bit of a layer of our workflow, our reporting, and other applications. So anybody want to pipe in? Is anyone on the call using the CDS yet, testing it out, thinking about it? Anybody want to comment? You guys are killing me. Come on.
We're starting to play around with POWERAPPS, and at Summit last week, I learned that we can, if we're on version 9 online, we can connect our POWERAPPS to the CDS, because we should be on that. I found that I probably need to open a support ticket with Microsoft because it was still forcing me to connect to Dynamics CRM to find any of my stuff, but that would be our first foray.
Thanks, Peter. And are you thinking, how are you thinking about using it long term, right, in terms of CDS connecting different applications or sharing data?
The goal is to try and make sort of the traditional Dynamics interface that people are used to more invisible. Our forms are just too big, having been built out over time. So here's a POWERAPP that has 6 fields as opposed to the form that has 100 fields that you're used to using. So just more ubiquitous.
Excellent, excellent. We're going to talk about POWERAPPS a little bit more in a minute. How about just raw CDS? I mean, anybody on the call, comfortable with, hey, we've had this integration, we've had it, all configured, all custom, and now what about using data from CDS? Thoughts? Anybody? Right. Well, CDS is still wet behind the ears. It's interesting. Microsoft uses their products probably for a good year or more before they actually even start to the buzz starts to happen and they really get out there. So some of the people who are actually internal to Microsoft must be like, oh, it's not new. It's been around for at least a year. So it's really interesting to see this just starting to crack open. So let's keep going. So why CDS in the world of Dynamics 365? And I think the number one driver, at least from talking with a lot of the partners, is we really do want to connect naturally our Dynamics ERP solution, and our Dynamics customer engagement, right? We're getting more and more demand for enterprises who, hey, we really want to use Dynamics AX or Dynamics Finance and Operation, but we also want the power of Dynamics customer engagement. We also have the driver of Office 365 and CE. And then just like with search, the concept of being able to use workflow, right, or flow, and business rules and the power of business rules outside of the world of Dynamics 365, but very involved with the world of Dynamics 365. And so that's why CDS starts to become really, really critical because, for many, many years, we've shared data between Dynamics and SharePoint, right? Kind of had their place. But there are so many more apps that people want to share data, structured or unstructured, all from within the Microsoft stack and also from outside the stack. All right, so Power Apps. Peter mentioned a little bit about Power Apps. So basically, start your thinking. Microsoft Dynamics 365 is considered a Power App. So as much as we initially think about an app as maybe a little mobile app that just surfaces a little bit of data, Dynamics 365 itself is considered a Power App. So I grabbed this definition because sometimes it's fun to just step back and look at what the definition is. I pulled the first sentence, right? What's Power Apps? It's a service for building and using custom business apps that connect to your data and work across the web and mobile. Not just your data, but the office or the enterprise or the small and medium-sized business data sets. The concept's also created to allow business users power to create, right? Because we still will always need developers, and there's always going to be a niche for a developer working in the world of Visual Studio. But there's so much more a business user can do without having to depend on a fully coded solution, right? For instance, I want to write a little Power App that just pulls 2 pieces of data onto my mobile. And so Power Apps are also a way for a business user to write their own app to access data, either from Dynamics 365 or from other sources. All right, anybody on the call want to talk more about Power Apps?
So Tom wrote in saying that they are using CDS for a small business with desperate data sources, including Excel and Access. And they built a couple of Power Apps to provide some quick hit functionality and eventually implement Business Central and possibly CE.
Excellent. Great idea. And for those Power Apps, I guess you have to respond to them, or you can unmute if you want to speak up. Was there a specific need, or was it kind of just experimenting?
Oh, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yes, we can.
Okay. A little bit of both, I guess. I know one of the ones that they're working on, and I'm not doing it myself. We've got a couple other guys doing it. Is some print functionality to pull some data out when they're done doing it. It's a testing group doing some testing and print the information out and send it to their client. So yeah, we're learning and testing, but also providing some kind of quick hit. We kind of asked them, hey, what can't you do right now that you would like to be able to do with all this, data that you have? And they're like, oh, this is really hard. Can you help us? And so we built a Power App to do it.
Excellent. Anybody else have any examples of how you want to use or you are using Power Apps?
We have new functionality that some of our teams want to implement in Dynamics. So the old model would have been, okay, we're going to create a new entity and we're going to build a new form and it's going to be the normal front end form, but we're toying with the idea of saying, okay, any new development is not going to use the traditional UI. It's going to be in Power Apps as kind of an experiment to see just how robust it can be with feature parity. So is there a way to do a thing in Power Apps that we could do with the sort of normal web UI, or does it have certain limitations? And we'll probably run up against them, but at least we're going to give it a rip.
Excellent example. Anybody else would want to contribute?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hi. So we're using model-driven apps for most of our build work at the moment, but we're also looking to embed a Canvas app into a model app to provide a mechanism for real-time data integration of surfacing data in real time from external systems, one of them being FinOps, finance and operations. So yeah.
Nice. And there's one of the key drivers that I had mentioned earlier is that, data from finance and operations and data from CE and working with those together. I would, in terms of hopes and concerns, I think one of the key things to keep in the back of your mind as we roll out with this model Dynamics 365 has a really intense, very customizable application security model. And it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out as we do more and more, because we want to make sure we can also honor the security that we want for our applications, right? The role-based entitlement, the ability to have different security for different roles. Anybody else want to comment about POWERAPPS?
So here's a quick question for you, Anne.
Okay.
As a developer, how much should I be learning Power Apps? How much should I not be focusing on Power Apps?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And for all the developers who are developers in the world of Dynamics 365, I think one of the key areas of learning and depth that you need to keep in mind is understanding what your options are, because your peer development team is that team sitting in Redmond and across the world who's building this Dynamics 365 application. And those developers need to understand what's already developed within Dynamics 365, what's available in Azure, right? From the Azure application stack, which is growing daily and very difficult to keep up with, so that you know what your options are. So Power Apps is another option for you, right? It's the ability to solve a problem with a different approach. And I'll give you an example. You might have a requirement or a need to provide a more simplified interface to collect data, perhaps in 4 fields from a small subsetted audience. Now, certainly you can create a form in Dynamics 365 and you can make that form specific for the small audience, but it might be that offering them a Power App might be a better solution. And so understanding what the options are and what the solutions are really important for a developer to understand. Does that answer your question?
Yep.
This is Kurt.
And I know how hard that is to keep up with.
This is Kurt. How you doing, Ann?
Hey, Kurt, how are you?
All right. I would say that Power Apps, the entire Power Platform, is extremely important for developers to learn. I think what we're going to find is we're finally at the stage where a lot of functions in code are very much like industrial or construction parts that you buy at Home Depot, and they're not going to change much. You know, there's standardization. Obviously, there has to be. So the more a person learns how to take what exists and put it together to put an app together for a business goal is actually a better skill than knowing how to, say, for instance, make your own 2x4s by chopping down trees. You know, why would you pay somebody to do that when you already have a standard? So I think it's very important to adopt the Power Platform right now.
I think the other thing I want to add to that is it's important, just as if you would pick up a tool off the internet, it's important for you to take ownership of and be able to code and be able to review the code that you're being given. So for instance, if you're given a Power App to use, or you buy a Power App, or you need to build a Power App, it's important for you to be able to code review that and take ownership and long-term understanding of it.
Exactly. Very good point. Thanks.
Sure. All right. So what about Microsoft Flow? So Microsoft Flow is in that whole arena, and it's basically a service that helps you create automated workflows between your favorite apps and services to sync files, get notifications, collect data, and more. Sorry for reading the slide. I know that's not helpful. But Microsoft Flow is all about that automated workflow process. So we can automate workflow in Dynamics 365. We can create custom actions. We can do a lot. But being able to pull data from different sources or different applications and create business type rules or business process with that is where Microsoft Flow comes into play. Obviously, probably one of the biggest pain points over the last 10 years is that whole concept of, if I'm using SharePoint, I want to know what's going on with a document that was added to SharePoint, and I want to use that intelligence with data that I have in Dynamics 365. So for instance, an approval process, right? Or I want validation that a document has been uploaded, reviewed, signed off on, and is now ready for the client. So little pieces like common business needs that have been around for a long time start to become really easy to solve with some of these new tools. And I suspect that other people can give me other examples, but one of the biggest reoccurring needs that I see on many, many different projects is this whole concept of, hey, we have an approval process, we have a process around some of these documents. Let's connect that approval process to our structured data where we want to know where something is within its process. And it's a document to begin with. Is anybody else using Flow? I think I have a slide on that. Yeah. Anybody using Flow yet? Or starting to think about it?
Got at least one in the chat saying that they have, or they are.
Excellent. Excellent. Again, to me, in the concept of maturity of features, we're still kind of in that version 2.0, version 1.0 delivery, but with updates coming every 6 months and faster, that concept of a 1.0 version is like instantaneous, right? We're already on 2.0. We're going to be on 3.0. We're going to be on 4.0 within the next 12 months. So Flow is another area where adding to your understanding of internal to the SQL database world, internal to Dynamics 365 workflow, now expand your thought process to Azure, right? And having Microsoft Flow running on Azure.
We're realizing that Flow and PowerApps specifically are helping us internally identify gaps in our business processes where we would say, okay, we are not capable of doing something. A developer has to do this, and so if budget was available, we might go out to a developer or a partner to help with it. As a nonprofit, we don't have a partner that we work with all the time, so we go long periods with like, I guess we can't do a thing. Now that we have this more accessible tool set to go in and start working on stuff, we started to realize very quickly that our business processes for the things that we want to use Flow and PowerApps for are not as clearly defined as we thought they were. And we're getting ourselves to the point where we're like, okay, we are not going to enter that world until we essentially self-qualify. We shouldn't build this thing because we're not going to have the information to build it well or build it reliably until we do some work on our own internal processes and guidelines of how certain aspects of our shop runs.
And that's an excellent point. I mean, some people will say, hey, I don't have a process for this, but even just sitting at a whiteboard and writing down how something happens, that is a process, right? Whether it's organic or structured or formally defined. It is very, very important to take that step to just, again, even if it's on a whiteboard, understand how does the process work today, right? And it crosses over both business process or human functionality, right? Where people do things, as well as technology that can either manually or automate pieces of that. We talk about not requiring a developer for PowerApps or Microsoft Flow, but you still need to step out of your comfort zone as a business person, and you need to think a little bit more structured. So it's important to push yourself into that space of thinking like a developer, right? Thinking about all the use cases or the if-thens. And so I think that's one area that everybody's kind of growing into, both from the developers having to think like business users and think about business process, as well as from business process and business users having to think about all these scenarios and use cases that could trip you up. I added this slide just because it's interesting. Right from the Dynamics 365 platform, they give you all sorts of ideas, right? You can literally go to flows from the settings menu for those of you who have access to the settings menu. And it has a tutorial. It has getting started. It has like literally self-driven training. Everything from, hey, I'm brand new to the flow to I'm experienced to I'm intermediate. And it also gives you kind of ideas and starter templates. Okay, so Microsoft Azure. So there's lots of other things happening with Microsoft Azure and the Dynamics team. So how about, Daryl mentioned Azure Functions. So the next presentation of XRM Virtual is going to dive into Azure Functions. I included this little link here because there's 3 blog posts on Azure Functions that are really interesting to help you start thinking about Azure Functions. Let's go back and talk about logic apps. I recently was on a project where we had a need to actually schedule the updating of data. And before we had Azure, on premise, we could use some of the Windows scheduling features. We had some kind of, I hate to use the word hack, but we did have some batch hack processing within the Dynamics database itself for doing some of these kind of batch processes. But now we have Azure Logic Apps. So we have the ability to schedule the update of data using logic apps on the Azure platform. So here's a very interesting marriage between what the developers are doing straight with Dynamics 365 and plugins and all that good stuff, and a place where they can start dipping their toes into using the Azure functions to update or manage data in the Dynamics 365 database. Has anybody worked with logic apps who's on the call? Okay, so there's as much as you guys hate this, a little study material for you.
No, this is pretty common in the scenarios we've been working with. As anybody knows with Dynamics, there's so many 2011 on-premise deployments that have to be moved up to the cloud. And then in addition to that, they often have other data sources from industry standard, we'll call them websites, but basically they're data repositories. And they can not only be accessed very much their Oracle databases and things like that. So the ability to use something like Kingsway software with those connectors allows us to make a DTS that would then, on schedule, upload data up into the cloud based on the criteria we set inside the DTS package, inside the SQL integration services. So what I'm seeing here is that finally, since we have all the SQL functions in Azure, we can mimic what we used to use with on-premise SQL.
Excellent, Kurt. Thank you. I had a situation where we actually wanted to update data based on the current date. And of course, the current date changes on a regular basis. And so we use logic apps to basically update some date fields. It's fairly simple concept, but being able to do that all online made it very efficient. Anybody else have any examples of either a need to schedule or a use of logic apps? All right, how about IoT, right? Internet of Things. So another area where the power of Azure is becoming more and more critical is this concept of pulling data from devices. And when I say devices, we immediately think watches or mobile devices, but I'm also talking about things like blood pressure cuffs, refrigerators, light switches, the video from your door. And when we talk about this data, this IoT data, there can be millions and millions of transactions. And you might not want millions of transactions in your Dynamics 365 database. You might not need them. You might want them, but I mean, you really might not need them. So being able to pull IoT data into Azure, filter it down to what's critical for your business decisions, pass that filtered data into the Dynamics 365 database, and associate business rules with that, the paradigm becomes huge, right? Because literally you can take not just millions, but billions of pieces of data. I mean, think of, 1,000 people having a blood pressure cuff giving data every 10 minutes, and filtering that down to just critical data. And that's where Azure and Azure Functions can really become powerful. And certainly we're seeing a lot more of IoT and Azure with the field services module, because field services is working very closely on some of these huge projects where IoT data is critical. But I think what you're going to find is that becomes more and more common as time goes on. Anybody else have any other examples in terms of needs or areas where massive amounts of data might be filtered in Azure and fed to Dynamics 365?
I know of one request some people are working on. There's a means to sample air samples for viruses, because they find that viruses are getting into ICU units in major hospital areas, and people are getting hospital-acquired infections. In the Southeast District, I was told by a representative that they have 250,000 deaths in the United States from hospital-acquired infections. So they are looking to pinpoint to reduce the amount of these happening within the hospital. The first goal is 10,000, and they want to know if Microsoft could actually come up with some tools to do this. I would love to see somebody get more interested in that. Of course, there's a lot of political problems within the hospital world, the business. But it's not their baby, it's us, because we go to them, right? So, imagine somebody's in a coma, they're put into an ICU in a coma, and 2 weeks later, they get the flu. How does that happen, right? Those are the things they want to avoid. IoT would be perfect for that.
Right. I mean, the hospitals have some of the same battles that Microsoft has in some sense, because of you have lots and lots of different departments who run themselves. It's like the states, right? Each state has its own government. But things are starting to happen. There is a huge demand to connect the dots. I think from a technical perspective, for those of you on the phone who are really in the technical space, right? The battle becomes being able to partner, like the Dynamics CRM team, partnering with the Azure team and sharing that specialty knowledge across technologies. In the early days, and even today, the SharePoint team and the Dynamics team have always conflicted a little, right? I build it on SharePoint, I build it in Dynamics CRM, and we've got to work really hard to bridge those technologies so that we can have the best of the best. The other two things I have on here are, because there is a technology that's the right fit for the right job. And understanding what that choice is, now that we have hundreds and hundreds of more choices, is going to be critical. Dynamics 365, yes, it can handle millions of transactions. There are clients that are handling millions of transactions a day. But if it's not needed, using Azure might be a better fit, right? Especially when you're trying to process billions of transactions within a 24-hour period. Other integrations, certainly that's going to continue to be more and more choices. We talked about CDS, but also, how we do our integrations, because I'm sure a lot of people on the call are also dealing with on-premise to online integrations. as well as across the online world. So for instance, being able to integrate data on the Azure cloud and AWS or Amazon Web Services and crossing that barrier. And then, Azure is also a player in this whole concept of data migration, because you might want to throw a lot of data up on Azure and have Azure feeding Dynamics 365 during a big data migration rather than drip feeding from on-premise to online to get your data migration done. So timing around that. All right. So other areas where Azure and the Microsoft team are working really closely together, from day one, Active Directory, long time ago, right? Active Directory has always been a core part of Dynamics and Dynamic Security. And we now have Azure Active Directory synchronizing with on-premise Active Directory to ensure single sign-on experiences for users, right? Every enterprise uses Dynamics online, and many do now, ironically, are setting up this sync where Azure Active Directory is syncing with on-premise Active Directory. You also are using Active Directory when you log into Serum Online. It's the online Azure Active Directory. So that's a key thing to be aware of. Sorry for the crying kitten in the background. I locked her out of the room. Azure Groups. How many on here are using Azure Groups? If anybody. It's amazing how many projects I've been on that are not using Azure Groups. And one of the key things and the key ways to use Azure Groups is to restrict access of your users to your development environment so that only your developers are accessing your development sandbox and testing and staging sandboxes. You can actually literally set up 4 Azure Groups, right? One for development, one for testing, one for staging, and then, everybody in production. You can also restrict production using Azure Groups. The key here is that you really need to work with your network administrator or the person who is your Azure administrator or the group of people who you rarely talk to about Azure administration so that you can manage these groups, right? There's a crossover between kind of, especially in enterprise, the people who own Azure own the domain and administration, the global administration, as well as the Dynamics team. And so there's a
question if the Azure groups are the same as resource groups. Do you want to speak to that, Ann?
I'm talking outside the Dynamics CRM database in Azure itself. It actually just says groups now. Can anybody answer that question better than me? Dang. So if you go into your Azure portal for Dynamics, on the left-hand side it says group. And it's actually where you configure your users and their licenses. You can actually set up an Azure group and then assign users to that group. And then you can assign that group to a specific instance. Now, there's some disadvantages to that, and that is that you have to manage that group and who's in it, right? So that's critical. So you might not want a group on production because you might have, 300 users. But for your sandbox, you might just have 10 users and you don't want your 300 production users in your sandbox. And that's how you can just set up a group for your development sandbox. All right. Any other questions on Azure Groups? All right. How about administrators? So the Dynamics team and the Azure team were nice enough to give us a Dynamics 365 service administrator. But this is another area to talk to your Azure team about, like, who is the global administrator? Who's the billing administrator? Who's the service administrator? You have literally, and you can see the list here, 10 different administrator types. The keys being the Dynamics service administrator and then understanding who the billing and the global administrator is for Dynamics 365 Online. In the smaller mid-sized businesses, right, probably one person is global administrator and can do all of this. In the larger businesses, we start to really need these different types of roles, differentiations, separation of duties. All right, so any questions? We've got, the last 15 minutes of this call, I thought I'd just open it up to just general discussion and any questions. And since you guys have been so participatory.
So here's one that I think it's a common question most people will have as they learn more about flow, is deciding when flow is an appropriate choice for solving a problem versus a workflow within CRM being an appropriate choice, and what to watch out for.
That's a great question. My kitten's joining us today. So if everything is within the world of your data in the Dynamics 365 database, and the process is fairly straightforward, then workflow within the Dynamics 365 world is probably going to be your best choice. And your choice is not just workflow or flow, it's also whether you want to have a plugin written. And there are reasons to have a plugin written, even if it's kind of a contracted, I just need this plugin written. Flow really is positioned to connect different applications, right? Now, Daryl, would you answer that differently? What are your perspectives on that one?
I wouldn't answer it differently, but I would just add to it to be careful that flow may incur extra cost. Workflow, you can't do anything to end up paying more if you're using a lot of workflow. You may be asked to do it less if you're doing something that brings down the whole scale group to its knees. But yeah, you won't have to worry about running out of workflow instances or paying more for workflows, where you could in flow, because you're going to share those flows amongst your whole group, basically. So that's just a major thing to be concerned about when you're opening up that floodgate of allowing people to create those on their own and managing those, and just being aware of that type of processes and what that could cost cost-wise.
Excellent point. And people shiver a little when they think about costs in Azure, right? Because we are changing our costing model when we start introducing functionality on the Azure platform. But it's really just a different way of thinking, right? I mentioned the logic apps, and we're talking about 0.001 cents per call. And although it adds up, it might only add up to $50 extra a year. So it can get out of control, but I think the key is to understand when it makes sense and when it doesn't make sense. And not to be, even though it's out of our comfort zone, because this whole concept is new, to just to learn more about how that's all put together and how it's working. I'll give you an example. There's actually a hosted translation service that you can tap into, and it gives you something like 500,000 translations a month free, and then anything over that is more. So understanding some of that is really where the game is. The last example is if you're using SharePoint. When you start getting into the online world, you might want to move away from SharePoint for, hundreds and millions of documents and move towards Azure Blob Storage. Both have integrations to Dynamics, but Azure Blob Storage is much cheaper. Different features, different strengths and weaknesses.
Jason has a question on ALM. Any thoughts, input on ALM for Flow and PowerApps, and how this could be managed?
Yep, that's a great question. And in the initial version 1.0 days, they didn't have an ALM story for Flow and PowerApps. It was a huge risk area, actually. They've just recently started to release ALM documentation and solutions, right? Technology and ability to move things between environments. I haven't ramped up on them on the new options yet, but it's definitely an area that you want to dive into. And I do know, and maybe there was a session at CRMUG Summit that would be worth watching, but that there are some new options available with regards to that. Any other questions? All right. Just want to thank everybody for being on the call, and really, really thank you for participating, for those who piped in and offered your perspective. I think it really shows how strong and what a difference it makes to have that community perspective. Daryl, I hand it back to you to do the wrap.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining, and again, thank you those that have joined in. A special thanks to Anne for coming in and just organizing this and lending her expertise to this. Much appreciated. And as a reminder, if there's something that you would like more information on or something you would like to speak on, please let us know. And besides that, thank you very much for joining. And if you need to refer to this to somebody else, look for the presentation being recorded later. And that's all we got. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.